Good morning. Let's get started. So back in January, I taught a short series of lessons about the first half of the book of Zechariah, which is the half that has visions that came to Zechariah at night. You recall I showed some Christian and Jewish artwork from over the centuries that depicted those visions. And today, I want to move on to the second half of the book, which is very different. Just to review the background of the book of Zechariah, the final minor prophets are actually pretty much in chronological sequence there. The final prophets were after the people had come back from Babylonian exile, and we're rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem and so on, as we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, God sent 3 prophets at that point in time to the people in Jerusalem, Haggai and Malachi and Zechariah. And the main theme of Haggai and Malachi was, you're not really working very hard at rebuilding the temple. You need to rededicate yourselves to God. You need to be more generous bringing materials to make the temple out of. And you need to work harder. You need to be more committed. But Zechariah was given a much more encouraging message, which was all of the blessings that God had in store for them, including in the future. And that's where we get into some messianic prophecies, which is what I'm going to focus on the next few weeks. The first half of Zechariah is the vision half, and we looked at those before. But the second half that we're focusing on are the prophetic messages, and many of them are messianic prophecies, the future anointed one, the future Messiah. And those can get kind of subtle sometimes, some difficult to understand. Oftentimes, they're recognized as messianic prophecies because they use the language that has been used in other messianic prophecies that came before this period. Prophecies from Isaiah, prophecies of David's in his messianic psalms, for example. So, the encouraging themes in Zechariah are that Jerusalem is still God's chosen city, Israel, the nation of Judah, is still God's chosen people. God has not forgotten them. He is keeping his covenant, and he has great plans for his people in the future, including in the distant future, when he sends the Messiah. This messianic prophecy section of Zechariah is one of the most quoted sections by New Testament writers. It's one of the most quoted Old Testament passage sequences, mainly in the Gospels, but also in the book of Revelation, where Zechariah is quoted. So, just to review, there's an overlap between the visions half and the prophecy half, because one of the visions is a messianic vision. It's a messianic prophecy. And that was in chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. And the words that I have underlined are the messianic terminology that clues us in that this is a messianic prophecy. Listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your colleagues sitting before you. Indeed, these men are a sign that I am about to bring my servant, the branch. Notice the stone I have set before Joshua. On that one stone are 7 eyes. I will engrave an inscription on it. This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts. And I will take away the guilt of this land in a single day. On that day, each of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and fig tree. All of that was spoken by the angel that appeared. This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts. Now, the underlined words are messianic references to other Old Testament passages. The first word we had underlined was sign. This is only used one time in the book of Zechariah, which is right here. And it's often used for the miracles that were performed by Moses, for example, during the Exodus. Some of your English translations will often have wonders, sometimes miracles, sometimes signs. When Moses was told to go to the Pharaoh and God would accompany him with signs or wonders, it's the same word. And that was a word that was used for the direct agent of God working before people. Now, the next word we had underlined was servant. My servant, who's being prophesied about, is Isaiah's messianic language. There's 4 messianic passages in Isaiah that are often called the servant songs. And the most famous one is the 4th one, because we often quote Isaiah chapter 53 about the suffering servant, about how the Messiah will be pierced for our sins, and so on. Sometimes we read that from the communion table, right? Because Isaiah, from the last couple of verses of chapter 52 on through chapter 53, is a prophecy that the Messiah will die for the people's sins. Now, if you recall from previous studies in Messianic prophecy, the Messiah in the Old Testament was spoken of in 4 different ways. One was that he would be a new prophet greater than Moses. And that goes back even to the books of Moses. That Moses was told that there would be one raised up greater than him. The second way the Messiah is spoken of is as a new king for the nation of Israel. And he would be a descendant of David. There were messianic promises made to David that one of his descendants would be on the throne forever. Is that true? Well, Jesus is a descendant of David, and he is on the throne forever right now. But it's not the kind of earthly throne that they might have anticipated. Right? The second way was king. First prophet, great new prophet. Second king. Third, a new high priest. There are priestly passages in the Messianic prophecies. Now, from the standpoint of the Old Covenant, what would be the problem with the Messiah being the new high priest and the new king? Do those 2 roles fit together? Recall that King Saul, when he didn't wait for the priest to come and started offering sacrifices himself, was rebuked and told that his kingship would be taken away from him. A king and a priest, there was a certain, what we would call separation of church and state. The king, with a few exceptions that we will look at, was not to do the priestly role, and the priest wasn't to rule like he's a king. Those are 2 separate things. A descendant of David would come from which tribe? Out of the 12 tribes. It's the tribe of Judah. A high priest comes from which tribe? The tribe of Levi. So This must have been confusing when the Jews were reading the Messianic prophecies. How can the future Messiah be the new high priest and the new king? And I think the answer is there has to be a new covenant. There has to be a new covenant in which we don't have the same priesthood. It's not a priesthood of the tribe of Levi. And this is addressed in the book of Hebrews, where the author of Hebrews points out that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. That's not the tribe for the priests. And he goes on to say that Jesus is a priest after the order or in the manner of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek, when we go back and look, Melchizedek was said to be a righteous king. He was also said to be a priest of God. And he was said to have no genealogy. They don't give his genealogy. So that tells us several things. Melchizedek was a type. In typology, he is an example of the type of the future Messiah. Both king and priest, but his priesthood does not come from inheriting it. It doesn't come because he's the son of a priest who was the son of a priest. That's how the priesthood of the tribe of Levi went on. But in Genesis chapter 14, this is long before Levi, we are already given a type of the Messiah. And the Messiah can be a new king and a new high priest at the same time in the same manner that Melchizedek was. Namely, to be chosen by God, not to inherit it, not to descend from someone. So then that fourth type was servant. Well, this had to be confusing too, especially the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Because what are the Jews looking for in the time of Jesus? They want a powerful new king. They want a Messiah who's the new king, and they're not really focused on him being the new high priest, and they're not really focused on him being the new prophet. What they want is a king to come kick out the Romans. They've got these Gentiles with their unclean feet stomping around the Holy Land and ruling them, and it's offensive to them. And that's what they want more than anything else during the Gospels that we read about, is they want the new king to come and lead them to victory. And they're picturing a military victory. They're picturing an uprising. And occasionally some of them jump the gun and start trying to push for an uprising like that's going to bring about the Messianic age, and that never works out too well. But that's what they're focused on. If you're the new triumphant king, then what are we to make of you're the suffering servant who's going to die for everyone? Isaiah 53 doesn't really sound like triumph, does it? It's not triumphing over God's enemies, it's dying. It's being abused. It's being looked down upon, being tormented. How can that be the same person? And so many of the Jewish rabbis in their teaching on this up to the time of Christ said, maybe these messianic passages are not all about one person. Maybe the new king and the new high priest, for example, are two people. The new king is the Messiah, and the new high priest is someone who accompanies the Messiah. And so then maybe the servant who dies is yet another of the helpers of the Messiah as opposed to being the Messiah. That's not really the language of the Messianic prophecies, but it was an effort to cope with the confusion. How can these all be the same person? Now, a priest can be a prophet, a king can be a prophet, but a king can't be a priest. And a victorious king can't be the suffering servant who gets killed and abused in their eyes. So they attempted to deal with the confusion of this by saying maybe it's not all one person, but the prophecies all indicate one person. Here in Zechariah, we see the phrase servant used. And then we have another messianic term that, if you weren't familiar with it from elsewhere, would be kind of confusing: the branch. He's the branch. It's pictured like a branch that comes out of a tree, or a branch that comes out of a stump, a shoot. The branch terminology is used multiple times for the Messiah. The Messiah will be a branch from Jesse, the father of David, or he will be a branch from David. That indicates genealogical descent, like in a family tree. He's going to be descended from David. But it's also an image of, when the image is used of a branch or shoot coming out of a stump, the stump would represent a very downtrodden Israel that has been conquered, carried off to captivity, ruled by Gentiles, and out of this devastation will come a Messiah. And so that is more messianic language. And then the stone, finally, the final messianic term. In Psalm 118, it says, "The stone which the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone." And it's a part of a messianic passage. And Jesus quotes from Psalm 118, for example, in Matthew chapter 21. He applies this to himself. When he's being rejected by the Jewish leaders, he says, well, the stone that the builders rejected is selected by God to be the cornerstone, implying there's kind of a new temple in some sense. And so Jesus makes a direct claim. It seems indirect to us, but he's making a direct claim: I am the Messiah, because that was a messianic prophecy. And once again, how can the Jews reconcile rejection of the Messiah? The stone that the builders rejected is chosen by God. I'm sure they thought, well, we're not going to reject the Messiah, are we, when the Messiah comes? That doesn't make any sense. But the messianic prophecy in David's Psalm 118 says, the stone which the builders rejected will be made by God to be the cornerstone. And Jesus said, that's me. So just as it's hard to see that the triumphant new king is going to die as the suffering servant, it's hard to see that the triumphant new king is going to be rejected by the people. But that's what the messianic prophecies said. And that's the way it all ended up happening, isn't it? When Jesus came, he was rejected. So, as a summary, Zechariah uses these terms that are within the Old Testament context, obviously messianic. And out of those four things, king, high priest, prophet, suffering servant, the focus in this particular vision, this messianic vision of Zechariah, is not on king. It's on priest and servant, two of the aspects. The high priest at the time of Zechariah was a man named Joshua, which in Hebrew, Yeshua, it's the name used, it's Jesus. Jesus is the Greek, Yeshua is the Hebrew. Is that a coincidence? I don't know, but Joshua the high priest at the time of Zechariah is being used as a type of the Messiah. Someday there will be this new high priest. But then that amazing statement happens that we read. This future Messiah will take away the guilt of this land in a single day. What could that refer to? Well, with hindsight as Christians, that's the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as an atonement for everyone's sins. So we have here a pretty amazing vision prophecy that's obviously about Jesus Christ. At least obvious in retrospect. But as I pointed out, think how confusing some of this might have been to Jews. Especially Jews in the first century whose total focus was, we want that conquering king. We want that victorious king. All this other stuff about new high priest, okay, fine. Suffering servant who dies, don't really understand that, not really looking forward to that. But new conquering king, yeah, we want that. Let's kick these Romans out of here with the new conquering king. But the passage in Zechariah, as well as all the other messianic passages, indicate that this Messiah is going to fulfill multiple roles at once. And when I taught about messianic prophecies a couple of years ago, I said, my claim is not that the Jews who read the Old Testament should have understood every last detail, but when Jesus comes along and God is working miracles through him, and then he's obviously working miracles under his own power. He's not just asking God, heal this person. He says, be healed, and they're healed. We saw many examples of that. And when he claims to be the Messiah, then I think people should have been open to having their questions answered by Jesus. I would expect that if you were a Jew in the first century, when Jesus first began his ministry, you would have had unresolved questions about these messianic prophecies. It wasn't all crystal clear to you exactly what was going to happen. And how can these four roles be fulfilled by the same man when your thinking is stuck in this old covenant where the priest and the king cannot be the same person, they can't even come from the same tribe? You have to have questions that are unresolved in your mind. But you should be open to Jesus answering those questions once you see what he does and how he teaches and the authority he has even to heal a blind man or to raise someone from the dead. Then you should be open to his answers, to his explanations. Not that it was all simple, it wasn't. Now, as we move out of the vision section, the first half of chapter 6 is the final vision. And on the heels of that vision, we get a prophecy. The word of the Lord came to me, take an offering from the exiles, from Heldai, Tobiah, and Jediah, who have arrived from Babylon, and go that same day to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah. Take silver and gold, make crowns, and place them on the head of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. You are to tell him, this is what the Lord of hosts says, here is a man whose name is Branch. He will branch out from his place and build the Lord's temple. Now keep in mind as we read on, you see I've got four things underlined here. Crowns, and we'll discuss how that's translated in various translations. Crowns and branch out from his place and build the Lord's temple. as the prophecy continues, yes, he will build the Lord's temple. He will be clothed in splendor and will sit on his throne and rule. There will also be a priest on his throne, and there will be peaceful counsel between the two of them. The crown will reside in the Lord's temple as a memorial to Heldai, Tobiah, Jedaiah, and Hin, son of Zephaniah. People who are far off will come and build the Lord's temple, and you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. This will happen when you fully obey the Lord your God. So let's take a look at that first key term here, which is crowns. Now, in Hebrew, the word that's given for crowns is plural. But the crowns, plural, are set upon one man's head, Josiah the high priest, or Joshua the high priest. And so that's confusing to some translators. So as a result, a lot of your English translations have crown as a singular. Sometimes they'll say an elaborate crown, thinking that maybe there's like two crowns that are connected, one circle of gold and one circle of silver attached together as a single crown. But what's the significance of having two crowns or two connected crowns? One of them is the priestly crown and the other is the king crown. They're put on one head. They're put on the head of Joshua the high priest. High priests or any other priest don't get crowned. Who gets crowned? The king. So why does this prophecy say that you should put a king's crown on the high priest's head? Well, because it really is the same man. It's not 3 or 4 men who fulfilled the 4 roles of the Messiah. The role of the new high priest and the new king truly are one person, the future Messiah. And so this is more typology of Joshua, the current high priest, is being used as a type of the Messiah to come. And the Messiah to come, we would say, wears 2 hats. He's got 2 jobs. He's high priest and he's king. And so there are plural crowns. They're placed on a single head. And we see a reference to something similar in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, chapter 19, verse 12 said, his eyes, this is a vision of the Son of God in heaven, of Jesus. His eyes were like a fiery flame, and many crowns were on his head. So, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, wears many crowns, not a single one. Now, having more than one role for a man is not something totally foreign to the Old Testament reader. We mentioned Melchizedek. Melchizedek was priest and king. Moses was prophet. He was also priest. We'll look at that next week. And David was a prophet when he wrote Scripture. And when he wrote, and we'll see this next week, when he wrote Scripture and he would say, this is the word of the Lord. He didn't just write he didn't sit down and say, I think I'll write a poem or, and write a psalm. In many cases he said, this is a message from the Lord. When you do that, you're acting as prophet. Obviously, he was also a king. And surprisingly, there were several examples in which David acted as a priest offering sacrifices on behalf of all the people. So that's an example of God making an exception, because when someone did that presumptuously, when someone like Saul took it upon himself to go offer a sacrifice, even though he wasn't priest, he was king, he got punished. Right? But David did so at the Lord's behest at least a couple of times, and we'll look at those next week. So there's some example already in the Old Testament that one man can be multiple things. He can be priest and king and prophet, or priest and prophet. And that's all kind of a typology also of the Messiah. So as I was preparing this, I thought about the phrase that we have in the New Testament. Peter says to us, to Christians, you are a royal priesthood. Now, all my life, I never really understood what was being said there. I just thought it means, oh, we're the new priesthood. You know, there used to be this Old Testament priesthood, but now all Christians are priests in some sense. We don't depend upon a separate priesthood. But that isn't all that's implied by that phrase, is it? Think in Old Testament terms. Does the word royal go together with the word priesthood? Royal has to do with the king. And the king and priest were separate, right? They weren't even from the same tribe, and so on. So when Peter says, you are a royal priesthood, what does that mean? It means that each of us is a royal servant and a priestly servant of the Messiah, who is both king and priest. In Old Testament times, a phrase royal priesthood would not even have made any sense. I didn't even realize that until just recently when reviewing this and preparing these notes. I've heard that verse all my life, but we are the new priesthood, but also we're a royal priesthood because we're serving the new high priest. And we're also serving the new king, who happens to be the same person. So next week we'll dive into that and finish that prophecy. Thank you.